be destabilizing the neighborhood, is there also saturation points, right? Where at some point these things don't matter anymore. So I'm gonna just take a look at the following couple graphs. This first one is just the regular um, uh, basic data from Boston, Newark, and Trenton. And if you can see it, the Trenton and the Boston are more similar in some ways than the Newark one. But this is a better way to look at it. So on the top left-hand side, I might have to go over there. You'll see. The order. So one is concentrated advantage. That's the index for on the left top is a concentrated disadvantage, right? Then there is on the the one next to it is percent black. In the left hand corner is poverty rates, and on the right hand corner is median income. So this is the distribution of neighborhoods between these different places. If you look at a little line within the box, you can see that Newark, right, is you can see that the difference between on the left hand one in each panel there is three boxes. So the one is Boston, then the middle one is Newark, and the right one is Trenton. And so you can see that concentrated disadvantage in Boston, right? Even the top neighborhoods, right in or let's look at the right bottom corner first of median income and poverty. What you can see is that Newark is just a very poor city overall. There are no neighborhoods like Boston or Trenton where there's a lot of variation between the neighborhoods. Right, the top corner, right, in the top right-hand side is percent black, right, which is one of the most in all the research and all the data sets from all the different cities. Percent black in neighborhoods is what drives incarceration, and so what you can see is that right within there is Newark is over 80% black, right, and then and even the right the most black neighborhoods in Boston, right, are less black than the lowest black neighborhoods in Newark, right, and the same thing goes for the median income and so on, or the poverty rate and the concentrated disadvantage. So in conclusion, right, it's important based on these various research in these various cities on the effects on you know on these different neighborhoods, that we should try to think about reconsidering this relationship between incarceration and crime, and that we should move away from thinking that right in places where there's lots of incarceration happening, right, this is very important depending on the place it's from. We should reconsider the relationship, and it does not necessarily lower crime rates, but instead increases crime rates. Oops, it's time to stop. So, right, have we reached a tipping point, right? Or the results support the crime increasing effects of incarceration, right? And we should be very careful to rely on incarceration as an all-encompassing solution to other kind of social problems.
Thank you, Todd and Geert. So what's going to happen now is that each of our panelists is going to give a short response, considering the issues that Todd and Geert raised. Then we'll have plenty of time for me to ask some questions, and we'll open it up to the audience to ask any questions that you have of any of the panelists. So first, I'm turning to Kate.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here in such excellent company, so thanks for inviting me. I manage the civil action practice at the Bronx Defenders, and just to say very quickly what we do at the Bronx Defenders is provide holistic, client-centered criminal defense, family defense, civil legal services, social work support, and advocacy for low-income people in the Bronx. We represent more than 35,000 people each year. We reach a lot more people through Know Your Rights trainings and outreach, and we work in interdisciplinary teams so that every client has seamless access to services to meet the needs that they identify for themselves. The primary goal of our model is to address the underlying issues that drive people into the criminal justice system and then mitigate the devastating impact of arrest, which include deportation, eviction, loss of employment, student loans, public benefits, removal of children from the home, probably a list you folks are familiar with. And we don't refer to those outcomes as collateral consequences. We use the term enmeshed penalties, which we think those consequences are not collateral at all, and that enmeshed penalties sort of better reflects the really serious risks and realities that our clients face in the criminal justice system. So I'll get back to those enmeshed penalties in a minute, but I want to just first confess that I'm totally provincial and all I could think looking at this is what would the results be for the Bronx? Which I think speaks to what a valuable frame the paper and the presentation creates for thinking in a more nuanced way about mass incarceration in communities and how those two things interact. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you, the Bronx is a borough with high concentrations of disadvantage. So my guess would be that it'll look a lot more similar to Newark than to Trenton or Boston, even though there's, of course, lots of vibrancy in the Bronx and lots of amazing communities and lots of strength. There's also a lot of concentrated disadvantage. And I have to say that data from Newark is scary because I fear that if it's sort of in the wrong hands, twisted in the wrong way, it can be used to argue that in communities that have the most disadvantage, incarceration might be the best or the only or some kind of good option for keeping crime down, which I think is not at all what the authors say and not at all the conclusion that I take from it, but sort of could be twisted that way. I think what the data actually show really compellingly is that it's, and as Gert was just saying, is that it's not crime, but it's disadvantage that's driving incarceration. It's racism and economic disadvantage. And also, I think what the findings illustrate and what the authors have really elevated is the absolute importance of neighborhood stability. And I'm not a social scientist, so I don't know whether it would be fruitful or feasible, but one of the questions that I had was what that prison cycling relationship would look like if you looked at actually jail cycling. So instead of long-term stays and sort of the effects of that, what are the effects of short-term stays, couple days, couple weeks, couple months in county jails, and even just of sort of coming in and out of the really local criminal justice system. But whichever way we look at crime and neighborhood stability, one of the questions I think that the findings raised that's really basic is, what can we do to strengthen neighborhoods with high concentrations of disadvantage without displacing residents as we strengthen those neighborhoods into other neighborhoods with high concentrations of disadvantage, which is one of the problems we've had in New York. And so, and I think when we're answering that question, I come from a legal services office, but I think when we're answering that question, there's a little bit of a trap of thinking that what communities need is just more services, more evidence-based services. And communities definitely need services. Like, I spend basically all my time going around trying to raise money for legal services in the Bronx. But I think that there's more to it, and that communities need political power and economic investment and real self-determination. And we try to sort of work towards that at Bronx Defenders by, as well as legal services, doing community organizing and partnering with community-based organizations and grassroots groups. But I think there's sort of a huge amount more work to do. And just to make a plug, there's this great piece that Vesla Weaver did on the Marshall Project website just last week about a person I'd never heard of, Robert Woodson, who's a conservative black activist from Philadelphia in the 70s, who believed that it would be mediating structures in communities, like churches, community organizations, and families, that had to be mobilized to combat crime. And he testified before Congress in 1973, arguing that the Law Enforcement Assisted Administration, which had just been formed, had to fund grassroots organizations in low-income communities, and especially in communities of color, and his plea totally fell on deaf ears. And nearly all of that money went to police departments, put more police on the streets, and to buy basically more equipment for policing. And he was undeterred and spent most of the 70s trying to change that course, and he teamed up with John Conyers, and he worked with the Congressional Black Caucus, and they didn't succeed. And the conclusion of Weaver's piece, I think, speaks directly to the findings here, which was that in the 70s, the crime debate was basically a contest between informal and formal social control. Formal social control, incarceration, supervision, won, big time. And finally, after 30 years, we're realizing what a huge mistake that was, and we're sort of trying to crawl our way back to strategies that actually strengthen and support community institutions that are crucial to containing crime. So that brings me back to enmeshed penalties, because something else was happening in that 30 or 40-year period while mass incarceration was expanding and that incarceration line was going up, which is that local, state, and federal governments were passing dozens and dozens of ordinances and regulations creating civil penalties for arrests and convictions in almost every venue: housing, employment, immigration, public benefits, the list. And those policies are really important, I think, in this conversation, because they cut directly at the most important institutions for stabilizing communities and people, which are families. Those are the punishments, I think, in large part, that have punished families when people get arrested and go to prison or jail. And some of those most severe policies, just in the past 10 years, while there's been more attention to them, have been chipped away at. But for the most part, we're still living with almost all of them. The chipping away has been really small. So I'll give a couple short examples from our work at Bronx Defenders, and then I will not take up more time. But we have a client who I'll call Mr. Lugo, who is a really active, involved father of 4 young children. His wife has serious medical condition, and she relies on Mr. Lugo for help with the children, but he can't live with his family because they live in public housing. And many, many years ago, more than 2 decades ago, he was convicted of a serious felony offense, and he served his time, and he came home, and he has 3 kids, and he's a great father, and he can't live with his family. And we have another client who I'll call Mr. Bryant, who's in a really similar situation. He is barred from living with the mother of his 3 children because of a drug conviction. And in their situation, one morning last year, he'd worked all night. He works as a merchandise loader. He'd done a night shift. The next morning, he picked up his 6-year-old daughter, brought her to the doctor, brought her home to her mother's NYCHA apartment, dropped her off. Mom was at work. Mom's brother was there, let Mr. Bryant in. He came in. He was exhausted. He'd worked all night, taken his daughter to the doctor. He lay down, took a nap, and that day, inspectors from the Housing Authority came to the apartment, found him there, and based on the one time that they found him in that apartment, have started termination proceedings against the whole family, kicking the whole family out of the apartment, which are ongoing right now. And those housing issues are only the beginning. So, we work with people who can't get security guard licenses, taxi licenses, home health aid licenses because of convictions. We've worked with people who get certificates of relief from disabilities, which are supposed to overcome licensing bars and create employment opportunities. They still can't find jobs, or they find jobs, and I hear this a lot, find entry-level jobs, and decades go by, and there's no upward mobility. Can't get promotions because of the background checks, right? And the last thing I'll just say is that, because this is sort of an issue that we're doing a lot more work on, is civil forfeiture laws, which have been getting more attention nationally. And in New York, our laws are not as egregious as in some places. But what they essentially do is function to take money and property out of the pockets of some of the poorest people in the city before they're convicted of any crime. So we represent a woman named Miss Cologne, who last time, right around this time last year, was stopped by the police with her boyfriend. She had $2,599 in her purse. She was arrested for prostitution. In her purse, she also had documents proving that $2,599 was the exact amount of her tax return, which she'd gotten that day and cashed. She was still arrested. Her case was dismissed on the next court date. And it took 6 months and tons of hurdles to jump through before we finally helped her get the money back. And that was with 2 attorneys and a paralegal working on her case, 6 months, and she didn't get it back until she'd missed 2 rent checks and had eviction proceedings started against her. So I think as these stories illustrate, it's not just prison that has destabilizing effects on families and communities. And one of the conclusions in the paper that I really appreciated is that it was the sort of the focus at the end about policing, that we don't just need to change our sentencing policies, we need to change our policing policies, because it's really any interaction at all with the criminal justice system that can kind of trigger all of these really destabilizing effects for families and communities.
Thank you, Kate. And so next we turn to Julio.
Good morning, everyone. You see me shaking my head here. It's hard to digest some of the information that we get. Let me begin by saying, as we all know, and I think Todd concluded too, that prison as a crime prevention strategy just doesn't work. I think we all agree on that, and we have to find better alternatives. You know, it's limited in its scope and serves no rehabilitative purpose from my standpoint. So again, I want to just thank all of you for being here this morning. My name is Julio. I run a non-for-profit in East Harlem. It's called Exodus Transitional Community. We work with women and men being released from prison, as well as young people ages of 16 to 24 who are on probation. We also have sites in Newburgh and Poughkeepsie, so when I hear about the blight of poverty, it hits home, because each one of our sites are located in the poorest areas in those communities. Let me just begin by when we talk about mass incarceration and the impact of communities. Our communities have been compromised for so long already, and I want to make sure that we understand how fragile they are before we get to the next step of now this cycling process of men being brought out of these fragile communities, being locked away 300-400 miles from their families, and then brought back to the communities with those very limited resources that are there as well. So I want to kind of bring it home when we talk about our communities. And prior to incarceration, there were failing schools, the zero tolerance policy around broken windows, which basically says we could stop, search, and frisk any young black or Latino man that we see who we think are quote-unquote criminals, but we perceive, doesn't matter who you are, if you got a backpack or your pants are sagging, you fall under that suspect. So we are talking about communities already that many men, we see 1 out of every 6 men being incarcerated. Brooklyn has some of the highest rates, South Bronx as well, having some of those highest rates. So as we looking at this, just the arrest rate, understand also our police contact daily of leaving your nature development project and going to the store and then being stopped on the way to the store. And so this level of distrust that now develops when women and men are released from prison, it magnifies itself. So when you take all this into consideration, and we want to talk about this perception of this new reality, right, that's formed once someone is released from prison, when we talk about mass incarceration, and I want to speak again from the view of the community. Our offices, as I mentioned, are in the community. So I want to just provide some real examples of people that experience kind of deprivation daily and still try to figure out a way on how to navigate a system that's structured for failure. And Michelle Alexander speaks about that very eloquently, as you all know, when we talk about these structures. For me, and I heard somebody mention the Koch brothers and now this whole conservative movement, and and it's great, whatever could get you to the table, if it's financial, fine. However, that's short-sighted if we don't have a long strategy in place. Right? We'll be revisiting this same conversation 20 years from now if if long-term solutions kind of aren't developed. I mean, so it's great that, there's this rumbling of, how do we dwindle the crime rates? What do we do with prisons? It's just costing us too much. But the reality, it may be short-sighted, and it's important that, again, we think about some long-term strategies. And those strategies come from a couple of places. But let me give you a quick example of a conversation I overheard. When we talk about the impact of prison on families, on children, and it kind of blew me away. And so I go to pick up my niece. She's in second grade, South Bronx, Ogden Avenue, in school. And I go pick her up, and she's online, second grader, talking to another second grader. And it's like, where's your dad? Oh, he's in a big castle. It's all the way upstate. Really? Yeah, and there's a lot of guards around. And I'm like, okay. And the other girl, oh, well, my dad is in prison. And she's like, wow, what's he in prison for? For stealing a refrigerator. And as I sat and overheard this conversation of two 8-year-olds accepting the fact that prison is a norm, is part of a normal conversation, we begin to look at how it's become acceptable in some of our communities. And I think, Todd, you point that out in one of the areas where we talked about how incarceration has reduced this punitive effect, right? When we see those high concentrations coming from same neighborhoods, kind of it just being this cycling that we talked about. I spent 12 years in prison, and I think for me it hits home when, and I love research, but I like talking about real lives. I like talking about the lives of what a felony does past the sentence. How we're totally blocked out of housing, how we're totally blocked out of any voting rights, how we totally cannot sit on juries, how when we talk about NYCHA, we're working with them to try to get them to open up a perspective. And they got one of our people in NYCHA, by the way, right now, so I don't want to totally... but those consequences that continually happen after prison. I had a gentleman in my office, 29 years yesterday, served 29 years. He's been out a year, working hard to find him a job. Working so hard to find him a job. Got him something, got his license, his culinary license. We got him Ronald as a cook. And got him the job. He did 2 weeks of training, sat there, and great. Been on the job 3 months. Gets calls by HR on Tuesday. So we see your criminal history, and we see you have multiple felonies. Doing excellent on the job. He said, yeah, it's 30 years ago. This is who I am today. And I need this job. I have nothing. I need this job. He confided to the HR people, I live in a shelter. I need this job. I'm saving for my apartment, which is his goal. I mean, I got 20 letters from him when he was inside talking about this apartment that he's going to get when he gets out. And he's waiting for HR's decision, and in the meantime, it is, don't come back to work as of this day, so we know what the results are going to be. We don't want you back. And this is daily. This isn't an isolated incident that I'm talking about. I mean, these consequences happen daily to our population. And I just think it's important as we talk about mass incarceration, as we begin to talk about solutions to mass incarceration, that we really, and all of us, like take this opportunity to look and say, what can we do today and not leave here with our minds, oh, wow, that was great talk. I love what he's had to say. What can we do today to begin this mobilization process where there's going to be some equitable justice when someone comes home from prison? Because as we talk about repairing our communities, we're talking about repairing, men and women that are in 53,000 men and women in New York State that are inside, that live in conditions that are I mean, you heard the Rikers Island. Many of you heard about Rikers Island. Some of you maybe followed the most recent story of the 3 correctional officers in Attica that charged with a misdemeanor, keep their pensions, um, but yet this brother, they knocked out his eye socket. Not an isolated incident, not an isolated incident at all. So coming home with this trauma and trying to fit back into the fabric of our communities, we're saying we need everyone's help. This isn't a place where we can say, well, we have a piece and we need everyone's help. And I think that's the crucial part of my reading and listening to Todd and listening to some of the things that you talked about. It's clearly a criminalization of the poor. It's clearly we have to find and develop different strategies that are going to help and be effective. And most importantly, that there be a fairness, that someone with a felony conviction be able to compete. We just want to compete. I'm not asking to jump ahead of the line. All right? I'm just asking to just allow me to compete in the employment market. And I think if we begin to strategize and put some of these things together, I think we can at least begin to solve some of the problems that exist within our community. So thank you, buddy.
Thank you. Okay. And I'm very pleased to welcome Jermaine Williams to speak next.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
How are you? Wake up.
That's it.
Thank you for having me here today. Esteemed panel. I'm proud to be here. I'm sure much more expert than I on this. My name is Jermaine Williams, council member for the 45th District in the City Council. These issues have always been. You can't hear me? Oh, can you hear me? Oh, I see. I got a big mouth. These issues have always been have been big to me, and I'll try to talk briefly because I like to get to the questions and what have you. But one, I just wanted to point out that we have a tendency to prejudge people's beliefs and their code of ethics and what have you, and it's always funny to me. And there was an article you might see today of an inmate who saved a corrections officer, and his ethos said that you don't violate women. You just don't do that. And you might have been surprised to hear that, but I know people who would probably be called a criminal in my life that I would trust with my life more than some of the upstanding elected officials I work with every single day.
It's a low bar.
You said it's a low bar.
Can be.
But I want to start more from macro because obviously the United States likes to tout the freedoms that we have, which a lot of them are true. But obviously we have some of the highest incarceration rates in the world. We're at, I think, about a little over 700 per 100,000. Russia is over 400 per 100,000. Rwanda is almost 500 per 100,000. India is at 30 per 100,000. They actually probably need to arrest some more people, but that's another story. But I say that to say we're not doing too well in a lot of ways. And I like to back up because for framework purposes, I always say that I feel like the country is working the way the country was designed to work. So from inception, the people who are supposed to benefit are rich white males. And so it's always amazing to me that people are shocked when the people who are benefiting are rich white males. And I say that because for me it's just a matter of fact that I like to say so that we can move forward in discussion, but people always get stuck in that. Well, how can you say it? And I don't understand. That's just what it is. Condoleezza Rice, I was watching something, she mentioned the birth defect of slavery. And so if that is true, I don't see how we expect that birth defect to just disappear so quickly, especially when we won't even admit that the birth defect has a major problem into the way that we're feeling now. So when it deals with criminal justice, it's just a furtherance of the birth defect. It's just based and rooted in the way this system is set up to be. You have people alive today who remember not being able to vote. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, I don't know if people can really understand that. They were not allowed to vote. That was 50, 60 years ago. That's just like right now. And I always think all of these things are always connected, of course, because any statistic you look at, it's way too hard to be black in America. Just any statistic that you look at, whether it's education, whether it's unemployment, whether it's the incarceration rate. Per capita, I think it's over 2,000 per 100,000. White, it's 300 per 100,000. So it's a terrible system, and it's hard to fix if we don't admit those facts. And people get stuck on those facts, and I'm not stuck on it. It's just that's what it is, and we can't fix it if you won't even acknowledge that that's where we are. That this is rooted in racist thinking, it's rooted in prejudicial thinking. And I heard Kate mentioning that the tough on crime policy won. It won because of who was perceived to feel the heat of all of that. If there were different communities perceived to feel the heat of all that, then it wouldn't have won. But it was, we're locking up those brutes and those people who are evil by nature. And so we're going to lock them up as long as we can, and that's the solution. But if we look back in history of this country, decades and decades ago, people may have seen Leonardo DiCaprio in Gangs of New York. There were people who came to the country from other places that had lighter melanin in their skin and did vicious things. They shot police officers, young people running around doing craziness. And the social elite at that time said these folks need upward mobility. They need jobs, they need education. So they crafted and designed programs to send to those communities that would offer them jobs and better education. And when the violence and the crime changed, because it wasn't always black and brown men shooting each other, when it began to change who was doing it, people then said these folks are victims of their own self-destruction. And if the only thing that was sent, if anything was sent, was a resource of police to lock them up and to beat them. And so we know what works. We just don't use it equally, and we don't apply it equally. And the question is, why don't we do that? And I think it's pretty clear why we don't do it. And we have to admit that so that we can fix it. So now we're talking about broken windows. A couple years ago, we were talking about stop, question, frisk. When we fix broken windows, we're going to be talking about whatever comes after that, unless we deal with the root of the problem in not just the NYPD, but the police departments across the country, which is based in their racial ethos and the way they believe and perceive these communities. That is what the problem is. And so this thing is working the way it's supposed to work. And so we have to jam that up, we have to admit what the problem is and address it. And so I think these communities have been intentionally ignored. And so I actually deal more with gun violence than I do with police reform, but the work I do in gun violence never makes the news. Only the police stuff does. But the places, so we started a national network to combat gun violence. And one of the things I want to do is get statistics from across the nation when we have on dealing with council members and aldermen, depending on how they're called across the nation, because a lot of times they're the first people, if they're good aldermen, the first people dealing with the violence. But, I mean, you tend to see a pattern of the places that are dealing with the highest gun violence. They're also, usually, the statistics track the same. The unemployment, the housing, what's available, what's not available, education, all in those same communities are similar. And we also know that. So now, why don't we fix those problems? And people always say that, well, these communities, they want more police. That's why we're sending more police. That is actually true. A lot of these communities request and want more police. And it's also trained, we're also trained to believe that that's the only thing that's going to work. But those same communities also cry out for their streets to be clean. They also cry out for a better educational system. I'm not even talking about what's taught. I'm talking about the building that they walk into that's overcrowded and that's falling apart, unless the side is a charter school side. That's another conversation. They also call for jobs just so that unemployment goes down. They also call for better paying jobs. So now we're seeing an economy that's going up. Jobs are being put into the economy, but it's all the low paying jobs. So we're feeling a slight benefit, but it's the low paying jobs. And so the benefit of having a job won't be as good as if you're cycles of poverty generation. So why are those calls never answered? Why is the only call that's answered the police call? And that's a question that needs to be answered. So I always feel like public safety needs to be redefined. And police are part of public safety, but they're not public safety. They deal with law enforcement. And that's a partner that I believe is very much needed. But the other partners have been excluded from being a great part of the discussion. So here in the city, what I've tried to do is redirect that discussion, and we've had some measured discussion, some measured success, so that other agencies are involved when it comes to gun violence. Where has the Department of Mental Health been? Where has the Division of Youth and Community Development been? Where has the Department of Education been? So they're now being brought into that conversation. But it was wild a couple of years ago. I used to ask at the hearings of the city council. Back then, we were only cutting programs. We were slashing everything. Bloomberg, that's a whole nother. But I would ask the DYCD commissioner, when we were slashing and burning all of their youth programs, have you spoken to the police commissioner about the effect this may have on the work that they're doing? And every year they would tell me no. So if you guys are not talking, that's a huge problem. You, the Department of Mental Health, should be looking at the same data that the NYPD is doing. So everybody could bring their resources and services to the community. Why is only one department responsible for this? And we saw some measured success for this I think in New York City. You know, the crime went down in the nation in the 90s. A lot of people take credit for it. It did go a little further down in New York City. Giuliani takes credit for that. But Mayor Dinkins, right before he left, did two things. He did Safe Streets, Safe Cities. He did put some more police officers on the ground. But he did things like open the Beacon School. At the exact same time, I don't know if people remember Beacon Schools. They're not around as much as they used to. But many, many schools in the city became community centers for large parts of the day into the night, where young people came in and had a place, a safe place to stay, a safe place to do homework, safe place to have sports. That happened across the city. Now